Welcome to punctuation video number 3. In this video, we're going to cover colons and semicolons. We'll start off with the colon. The colon is an undervalued piece of punctuation. It's often misused or just simply underused. We use it for 3 different reasons. The first is to introduce a list or series of examples. Most of you are probably familiar with this usage. The second use is to explain what precedes the colon, and this is one that is particularly valuable for a specific style of writing. The third is to use it to introduce a quotation. All right, let's take a look at using the colon to introduce a list. In this example I have several classes this term. Hopefully you can identify this as an independent clause. So as a rule, I'd like you to remember that we're always going to have an independent clause before the colon. And we also want to note that this independent clause is introductory. It's introducing something. What comes after the colon is an explanation of what we've introduced. So let's look at this example. I have several classes this term. Well, we can ask a question when we see a colon. What are these classes? The answer, English 1150, Model Rocketing 300, and Online Gaming 1000. So we have an introductory independent clause, and then we have afterward an explanation of what we've introduced. So a list is formed after the colon, and an independent clause comes before that list. Let's move on to using a colon between independent clauses. This usage is almost exactly the same as the one that we just looked at with lists, except that instead of a list after the colon, we're going to have another independent clause. This independent clause after the colon is going to answer a question that could be posed about the first independent clause. So in other words, we're going to introduce something, then say something about it. Let's look at an example. My English instructor is wonderful. We have an independent clause. When we see this colon, we know that we've now introduced something and we're going to explain it. So what is the question we can derive? My English instructor is wonderful. Why? Well, he makes punctuation fun and easy to learn. Here's an example for you to try. The river was dangerous. We have an independent clause. Once we see this colon, we know we're introducing something and we're going to explain something about it. What's the question here? Why was the river dangerous? Well, the spring runoff had made it flood several towns. One final example. Do not bother Grandma while she's baking. Why not? Well, she will hit you with her broom. The last usage of the colon that we're going to look at is much the same as the prior two. We use it to introduce a quotation, and we're going to have an independent clause before that quotation. Mr. Thompson went into great detail about how much he loves being a dog hairstylist. Well, we know once we see this, we've introduced something, now we're going to say something about it. In this case, we're going to get a direct quote from Mr. Thompson. When I see dogs looking in the mirror and feeling beautiful, I feel like I'm going to cry tears of joy. It's now time to look at the dreaded semicolon. Teachers across the planet have given this punctuation mark a bad name. It's really not as difficult as it may seem, and it can be used, and it is widely used. Semicolons are used to connect closely related independent clauses. One thing I'd like you to do when you're thinking about using a semicolon is to compare it against the colon. If the second independent clause elaborates on the first one, a colon is more appropriate. Let's try and look at the difference between the semicolon and the colon. Once we understand the difference, it will help us in choosing which one we'd like to use when we're writing. First, let's look at the semicolon. Here's an example. So we know semicolons join independent clauses that are closely related. Children should learn about the Holocaust. Adults should always remember it. Okay, the subject of the first clause is children. They're the ones learning. The next clause is adults, and they're the ones that should remember. Okay, so we can see that we have different subjects, but there is a relationship. The Holocaust. One is about learning the Holocaust, one is about remembering it. So this is a correct usage of the semicolon. When we move on to the colon, hopefully you remember what we're looking for. Children should learn about the Holocaust. When we see this colon, we know right away we've introduced something and we're going to explain something about it. So what is the question we can derive here? Well, why should children learn about the Holocaust? The answer, it will help them to understand the horrors of discrimination and genocide. So once again, we have that introduction and the explanation of what we've introduced. Here, we clearly don't have that. We're moving on to something new, but there's still a connection. So in the end, if the colon is more appropriate, the subject of the second clause will often be more closely related to the subject of the first clause. Now I'd like you to use colons and semicolons correctly in these sentences. So pause the video now and remember that you're looking for independent clauses and you're going to put either a colon or a semicolon in between. All right, let's take a look at the answers. You'll notice that I have the sentences color-coded, so each clause in green is independent and each clause in blue is independent. So it's really just this central area we're looking at with regards to punctuation. So in this first example, we have the novel we read was shocking. Why? It used humorous yet offensive language. So therefore, we have this questioning state here derived from the colon and the answer or explanation coming afterward. The second example we have, she worked in the fashion industry. Her children followed in her footsteps. Hopefully you can see the difference here. There's not really a question we can derive here with regard to the second clause. So really we're just moving on to her children following in her footsteps. But of course, she is what we have in common here. Okay, so it is a semicolon. Number 3 here we have lawyers are great people. Well, why are they so great? Well, they help you weed through important legal jargon. So once again, we've introduced something that lawyers are great, and then we've explained why they are great. Now this last one is a little bit tricky. If you struggled with it, that means you're doing well. You're understanding the concepts that I'm talking about. Study hard for your exams. Now I have a colon here. Why? Well, your future depends upon it. Okay, that is one way that we can look at this, but we could also put a semicolon here. Now, the reason for that is we can look at it as two statements instead of one joined together, if you will. Study hard for your exams. Your future depends upon it. Okay, so if we put the semicolon, it becomes more of a pause. It's not an introduction explanation. Okay, so you could put both there. I would say it leans toward the colon, but it really matters what you want to say with your sentence. So remember, there are sometimes gray areas with punctuation, and this would be one of them. You won't see this on your exams, but I just want you to be aware of it. Now we're going to move on to conjunctive adverbs. These are used to connect independent clauses. So once again, if you're not understanding clauses, dependent versus independent, go back to the earlier videos and review that material, because most of the rules that we're looking at relate to clauses. So in this case, we have independent clauses on either side of the conjunctive adverb, and it's always going to have a semicolon and a comma. Here's a list of common conjunctive adverbs. You can search on the web and find lists that have more, but these are the ones that are most often used. Using conjunctive adverbs follows the same rules that we've already learned. We know that they join independent clauses, so they become in between independent clauses. We also know that coordinating conjunctions are placed here. We know that a period can be placed here. We know that colons can be placed there, and we know that a semicolon on its own can be placed there as well. So let's look at this example. This grammar lecture is as dry as the Sahara. However, it is quite informative. So hopefully you can see that conjunctive adverbs are almost like a road sign to your reader. It tells the reader where you're going with your thoughts. The grammar lecture is dry, but on the other hand, or however, it's informative. So it's a really good tool to tell your reader where you're going. Another example. I'm excited to learn how to use semicolons properly. Furthermore, I cannot wait to use them in my essays. Once again, we have an independent clause, a joiner or a conjunctive adverb, and then we move on to another independent clause. Our last example here, some disadvantages in skipping English class are worse than others. For example, students may miss out on the greatest PowerPoint slideshow on earth. So we have our conjunctive adverb joining independent clauses here. This one is particularly useful. If you're going to be writing research papers, you're probably or hopefully going to be providing examples. If you're going to provide an example, let your readership know. This is an extremely clear way to write. Let's read this without the conjunctive adverb first, then we'll add it in. Hopefully you can notice the subtle difference in understanding. Some disadvantages in skipping English class are worse than others. Students may miss out on the greatest PowerPoint slideshow on earth. When we read it that way, we have to piece this second clause together in our minds as we read it. Now, if we bring this one into play and envision that we haven't read this second part, let's see how that changes. Some disadvantages in skipping English class are worse than others. For example, students may miss out on the greatest PowerPoint slideshow on earth. Hopefully you can see that that second reading is much clearer than the first. One question that I frequently get from students is, what's the difference between conjunctive adverbs and subordinating conjunctions? Well, there is a big difference between the two, and we'll look at that. Conjunctive adverbs can be moved throughout the clause. That's one thing that we want to remember. One way to look at conjunctive adverbs is to notice that they are an introductory fragment. They are connected to this second clause, this independent clause here, I won the race, therefore is an introductory fragment. That's why we have the comma here. Let's get rid of this first clause and pretend it's not there. Therefore, I won the race. We can write that, assuming, of course, we have some context as to what came beforehand. So really the comma is just doing its normal job here. The semicolon is doing the same thing. If we take out therefore and this comma, we would have I trained hard, semicolon, I won the race. That is perfectly fine if you review what we just looked at with regard to semicolons. So remember that these two are just doing their regular job in this sentence because this one is preventing a comma splice. Okay, and this one is separating an introductory fragment from our independent clause in this second part of the sentence. So remember that this can be moved around because it is one of those introductory fragments, and that's why we have the comma. So in this example, we have I trained hard and I, therefore, won the race. Okay, if we look at this second clause, I, therefore, won the race. That one works because we know we can remove this. If we have two commas around a fragment, we can take it out of the sentence, and it will not affect the meaning of the clause. I won the race. It still means the same thing. And if we get rid of this, it also becomes clear that this is a coordinating conjunction. We know and, but, or, for, nor, yet, so can be used to join independent clauses. I trained hard, and I won the race. Subordinating conjunctions cannot be moved throughout the clause, and they create a questioning state. Okay, so down here we have because he trains hard. Well, we know subordinating conjunctions create a dependent clause, so this becomes a single unit fragment. So we don't have because comma here. We wouldn't put that comma because the fragment ends up here. Okay, so it creates that questioning state of mind. Because he trains hard, he won the race. So that's the difference between conjunctive adverbs and subordinating conjunctions. Here are some popular examples of the two terms that we're looking at. Conjunctive adverbs, remember that these are definitive. They lead us in a certain direction. They're like a road sign to our thoughts. Also, consequently, furthermore, moreover, accordingly, etc., etc. Subordinating conjunctions are much different. These are going to come at the beginning of a clause always, and they're not going to be movable, and they're going to create that questioning state. So we can think, because I'm tired, as I'm tired, since I'm tired, if I'm tired, now that I'm tired, I'll go to sleep. Similar for each one of these. They're always going to create that questioning state of mind. The last usage of the semicolon that we're going to look at is with advanced lists. I highly recommend you avoid writing advanced lists. I find them stylistically to be inferior to other ways of writing. I would recommend that you split up your thoughts instead of writing them in a single sentence like this example that we have here. We went to the carnival and saw several scary things, colon. Well, hopefully you can see that that's an independent clause. We've introduced something. Well, here comes our list. Our instructor, who is usually professional, operating the zipper, several drunks, the unpredictable kind, fighting in the parking lot, and a person, either a man or woman, walking a pet pig. Okay, let's take a look at this long sentence. You'll notice that we have semicolons here. And the reason that we have these semicolons is to denote where the list items begin and end. If we just put commas there, you'll see that we have these asides throughout the sentence as well. So these each create 2 commas. So in total, we have 8 commas in this sentence, and it would be extremely confusing to anyone trying to make sense of it. So what we've done is we've taken the commas that separate the list items and turned them into semicolons. So we can read this without the asides, and you'll see where commas would normally go. We went to the carnival and saw several scary things. Our instructor operating the zipper, several drunks fighting in the parking lot, and a person walking a pet pig. Okay, that one makes sense, but once we add all these asides in, it creates confusion. So I would recommend, once again, just not writing this way. If you need to say this much in a single sentence, break it up into several sentences. That's it for punctuation video number 3. Make sure you watch this video again so that you can get a clear understanding of using colons and semicolons.